Okay, it looks like we're recording. So, welcome to Conversations with Carolia. This is a recorded edition because I'm interviewing someone who lives over in the States. So, this is Shambhavi Saraswati. Welcome, welcome. Yay!
Hi.
My name's Carolia, for those who don't know me. And Shambhavi, I have to practice saying that name properly. Shambhavi.
Shambhavi.
Emphasis. Shambhavi?
Shambhavi. It's like
Shambhavi.
just the heaviest syllable is the first one.
Ah, Shambhavi. Okay.
Shambhavi.
I
It's
may just
okay.
keep I may just keep failing, and I know that that's okay
I
too.
love New Zealand accents, so I'll take whatever you got.
Awesome. So the reason that I've asked you to come and chat to me and have this conversation is that I discovered this book of yours, Tantra, the Play of Awakening, last year. And you teach in the tradition, there's so many different names for this tradition, Trika
There
Shaivism,
are.
Kashmir
Yeah.
Shaivism, and I love in this book you call it direct realization. That's one name that
Yes.
you give it.
Yes,
Yeah.
that is something that describes a group of traditions, some of which I've studied in, that include
Mm-hmm.
Dzogchen and a couple of other traditions from that part of the world. And it's actually a phrase that's used both by some of the founders of the tradition and by my root guru, Nana Mahima, to describe really the essence of the view and the practice of these traditions, which is that your enlightened essence nature is available to be discovered directly by you in any moment. The Sanskrit term for this is pratyaksha darshana, which means direct seeing or direct understanding or direct knowing.
Mm-hmm. So how did you find your way to these traditions? Because I'm guessing you're American. Where did you grow up in the States? Like,
I grew up in Philadelphia
mm-hmm. Yep.
in a Jewish family that was really not practicing. And I had a feeling since I was a little girl that there was just more here than I could experience or see. It
Mm.
was the absolute most urgent feeling in my life. And I was enormously pissed off that I couldn't see everything and know how everything was. I really felt imprisoned
Mm.
by the limitations of my perception. And so I tried a lot of different things to try to break through this, including studying science in undergraduate school.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't consider myself to be a spiritual person, or, there were moments when I thought I was an atheist. But at some point in my late teens, I started looking to spiritual traditions, and I sort of dabbled in trying to reconnect with Judaism, but that didn't work out for me. And then one day I really, I don't know why, I've written about this, because I was really, and to this day, I'm extremely allergic to anything New Agey or woo-woo. But for some reason, I went to this place. I was living in New York City. I was 27 years old, and called the New York Open Center. And I went to a workshop there that was called something like Discover Your Intuition. And it's almost like I was in some sort of trance or fugue state. Like, I just cannot remember at all why I went to this thing. It was so out of character. But in any case, the teacher was, among other things, teaching classical Kriya yoga, where you go into your subtle channels and you breathe in certain ways and you explore that energetic aspect of life. And, even though there was a lot of New Age trappings to this, I just thought, this is it. This is what I've been looking for.
Mm.
And, some years after that, I moved to California and met a second teacher. And that was the teacher, this was years later, who told me that this tradition was from India and then it was called Tantra. I had no idea. I mean,
Ah.
I was not a young person who was like into things so-called Eastern. So it was completely news to me. And I remember I went to the library after she told me this, and I got out this book called something like India. It was like 8,000 pages long. And I literally was starting from zero. But what happened was, over a number of years, these practices of mantra and Kriya Yoga and other things just became the texture of my everyday life. And I at that point, eventually my mom died and I inherited a little bit of money. I was already in my mid 30s by that point, and I went back to graduate school. I went to graduate school, and I remember one day, literally one day, thinking, "Oh my God, I have a spiritual life."
Like you were just recognizing what had already been going on for however long.
Exactly, I recognized that it was there in the fabric of my everyday life every minute. I was very lucky because the practices that I learned, starting with the teacher at the Open Center, were things that were in the beginning largely integrated into everyday life, things you could do while in the supermarket line or whatever. So it really became something that was informing my moment-to-moment experience most of the time. It wasn't until later that I got a different kind of a teacher, like more of a lineage-based teacher, and really learned seated practices and started doing hours of meditation and mantra sitting on a cushion every day. So it was really, for someone like myself who tended to be a little stuck in my head, and relying too much on concepts and ideas, it was really a blessing that I started out in this very experiential way and really know what I was doing or where it came from. That was really a blessing for me. I had nothing to really grab my mind onto.
Yeah. So when you discovered that what you had been doing was a Tantra practice, or within the Tantra, did you know what Tantra was? Or did you have to go look that up as well? Yeah.
And, I looked up online.
Oh, no.
Realized that whatever anyone else was talking about was not what I had been studying.
Yeah.
And then I found through just research online a lineage from India that was teaching a sort of synthetic modern day version of Trika Shaivism. And there was a sobriety about it and a straightforward quality about it that appealed to me a lot. And that's when I really started studying properly and eventually got good view teachings. And then, one of my teachers recommended that I start studying Dzogchen also, because he thought that I had a knack for meditation and I should learn it in a lot of different ways. And I did that. And, I've also, those traditions are very related historically and also esoterically. But it really just snuck up on me. And I have found that throughout my spiritual life that anything important just sneaks up on me.
Interesting. Is it like a remembering or a recognition, as if you've, in previous lives, perhaps you've done these practices or been in these lineages, or because 27 is like Saturn returns as well, too, like from an astrological.
Oh, yeah, you're right. Yeah. Well, I describe that when you meet the right teaching for you, or the right tradition, or the right teacher, it's like you're in a room and the door opens and an old friend that you'd forgotten comes in.
Yes.
And your heart just opens and, the flood of feeling comes out.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably true for lots of people in lots of different kinds of traditions, not just this one. But of course, there's a sort of primacy of this idea of recognition in Trika Shaivism and also Dzogchen, that the teacher's job, in a way, is to orchestrate you having a direct recognition of your real nature. And then you work with that experience. You try to rest in that experience and increase the duration during that you're able to remain undistracted from that experience. Recognition is one of the major both concepts or aspects of view, and also incorporated into the practices that we do. So it's not an ordinary word in the direct realization traditions, but there is that sense all along. Meeting the tradition. When I've told this story a lot of times because it's so funny, but I was in grad school and I got out this book about something to do with the Trika tradition.
Mm-hmm.
And it was this giant book written by some French scholar, extraordinarily erudite, and about a third of it was Sanskrit, which I didn't even know anything about at the time. And but the little bit that I could understand of it absolutely electrified me. I mean, literally my hairs were standing on end. I was just felt this was for me. The question of past lives, I mean, who knows what lives they are, the linear time is our experience and our condition. But I have definitely had experiences of remembering practices from both Trika and Dzogchen tradition, dreams about different things that could be construed as visions or whatever. My teachers have said, and you can read this in books from the tradition, that these kinds of traditions are supposedly for mature practitioners, and that you don't end up in them unless you have some past life experience. But really,
who knows?
What difference? Who knows? Really, I think those kinds of statements should be, taken with a raised eyebrow.
Yeah, I can understand that. What I loved about reading this book. My experience, I studied with Christopher Tompkins just briefly in 2010 in Venice Beach, and he introduced me to Tantra and to a particular practice. And I'd just been doing practice, and hadn't read anything or engaged with any teachers. And then last year I had this sort of prompting, and you need to start teaching this. And I was like, I can't teach this. I'm not, and I went like, well, if that's going to happen, I'm going to have to go and start reading, within the lineage, within the tradition. And your book was one of the ones that I found. I think I found it on Amazon.
Yeah, they're all on Amazon.
Yeah, and what I loved about reading this, because I've read a few different ones, over the years, is that it felt like you were within what you were speaking of, right? That you weren't talking about something from an academic perspective or from an information perspective, but you were simply, it's like you were walking in a land in a particular way and describing it in such a way that someone who has never potentially been to that land can feel the difference. As I went further on, I realized, is this what it's meant by view teachings, that you're transmitting a view teaching? Can you speak to that? Because I think it was the first time that I'd ever come across that phrase of a view teaching, which feels very different from a information, detailed, how to do this kind of teaching.
Mm-hmm. Well, we live maybe at the end of the Kali Yuga, who knows, but there's a lot of confusion spiritually. And when I first started writing about this tradition or my experience in it, and I first started teaching, I had to have some bottom lines to make sure that I maintained integrity in the presentation of the teachings. And one of those bottom lines, or maybe the bottom line, is to never teach about anything or write about anything that I don't have as part of my own experience. Mm-hmm. And then there's a couple of topics that I do teach about in a passing way. For instance, the bardas of death. I'm not realized enough. I don't remember going through the bardas of death. So I'll always say something like, this isn't my own experience. I'm sharing with you what my teachers have taught me. But by and large, I would say, 98% of what I write or teach about, I have some experience of. And that is the qualification for giving view teachings. So view teachings are the most important kinds of teachings that you get from a teacher in these direct realization traditions. View teachings let you know the bigger universe in which you are practicing. They let you know what feeling orientation to sit down with when you do practice. So the most easy example to understand is puja, when you're sitting down at an altar and making offerings to a deity or a guru or something, some symbol. In different traditions, there are wildly different views of the feeling orientation, the bhava you should have when you sit down to do puja. And a very common one is that you are propitiating the deity, you're asking for something, or you are talking to or offering to a being that is different from you in some fundamental way. And of course, you don't come out so great in that equation, you know, you're and the deity is the better one. In our tradition, we have the view that the deities are condensations of these cosmic wisdom virtues like compassion and playfulness and intelligence, and that we, on some level, we are, and everything has an equality with everything else, and that our job is to discover those cosmic virtues that already exist in full measure and untarnished within ourselves. So when we sit down to do puja, we're having the orientation that we are trying to, we're bringing the deity out of ourselves so that we can worship those aspects of ourselves that we are trying to realize more fully. That is a very different orientation, and so leads to a different result. Practice. View teachings let us know what a tradition has to say about cosmology, you know, the becoming and the going away of everything, what it has to say about the nature of the self, the nature of reality, the purpose of spiritual practice, how we should do practices in the bigger sense. A lot of the time when, especially in the United States, I don't know how it is in New Zealand, but a lot of the time when these traditions are being imported into the US or simply absconded with by someone who's already here, you get some tiny little piece of something to do. You know, someone says, here, do this mantra, or do this asana, or do this kriya, or, you know, sit down and do this kind of meditation. But you have no idea like where that practice fits in, you know, in the large scheme of a tradition. You furthermore really have no idea what the view of that practice is, how you should orient yourself when you sit down. And a lot of times, if you're given view, it's like a big mishmash of stuff, not very clear. So view gives tremendous clarity and context to our practice. And then the other thing, you know, you mentioned was the transmission of view. And this is where having a teacher who has done the practices to the point where they actually have fruit of those practices is important, because there is a kind of an alchemy that I don't think anyone can fully explain that happens when a teacher who has had at least some realization in those practices teaches them to you with correct view. And that is, you have something of an experience of the fruit of that practice before you begin, or you have something of an experience of your real nature. When I do a lot of teaching called satsang, where people just gather informally, it's one of my favorite ways of teaching. And basically it's just an excuse to be with everyone in a trans environment where people can have a different experience of themselves. Maybe they can have a different experience of other people, or of space and time, or they can just feel more relaxed in some way. This is the alchemy, that the experiential alchemy that is absolutely key to these traditions. There is no teaching and there is no practice without this direct experience that happens somehow when we get together.
So then how important have your relationships been with your teachers over the years?
Central.
Yeah.
Absolutely central. So first of all, I love, and love is just too weak of a word. I'm completely head over heels with the whole dynamic of the arising of teacher and student. I always have
Mm.
been. Like for me, it's always been about guru. It's never really been about deities. I've done a lot of deity practice just as a matter of course because teachers told me to do it. And it's not like I don't enjoy it or haven't gotten anything from it. I have. But for me, it's always been about the relationship with the teacher and the transmission and the example of the teacher. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
it's just, I think, the most engaging relationship one can possibly have as a human being.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and in our traditions, that relationship is the central practice.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you are doing, deity practices and stuff, there's a whole group of practices, and even I'd say non-practices because they're not really formal, called guru yoga, meaning that you experience your equality with the teacher or your unity with the teacher. So in that sense, the teacher is like an appliance that helps you to
I like it.
helps you to experience your continuity with everything.
Uh-huh. So is it
And
like,
they also help you to experience all the ways in which you're avoiding that. So it can be very painful too.
mm-hmm. So that teacher student, does it flow both ways? So when you're in the role of teacher and you're working with students, is that your experience as well of almost as if your students are also your teachers?
No, not in that ordinary way.
Mm-hmm.
No. People like to think that um, because it makes them feel less threatened. But, on an absolute level,
Mm-hmm.
everything feels like guru on an
Yeah.
absolute level,
Mm-hmm.
but not in the ordinary day-to-day working with students. Do I think of or experience students as being like my own teachers, like my gurus? I don't experience them being that.
Mm-hmm.
They're operating with more constraints than the teachers that I've had.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like I don't learn things. Of course, I learn things in an ordinary way, but
Mm-hmm.
it's not like it would be it to my way of thinking, a missed opportunity to hold a concept out of some misplaced sense of egalitarianism, that students are gurus and gurus are students to each other.
Mm-hmm.
I'll probably get into trouble for saying that, but that's what I think.
Yeah. But you're kind of used to getting into trouble a little bit. I just listened to,
That's true.
yeah.
That's true.
I'm halfway through listening to one you did talking about being a spiritual teacher, but also being engaged politically or social justice.
Yeah.
And can you speak a little to that? Because there does seem to be a separation sometimes seen between being spiritual, so not worrying about what the world is doing because it's an illusion, or starting to realize that showing up to every moment means attending to what is required.
Well, this tradition does not subscribe to the idea that the phenomenal world is an illusion or unreal. But that's a whole other story.
Yeah.
So one time, Ananda Mayama, my root teacher, was asked, do we need to renounce the world? You said, why? Everything is the same. Everything is God.
Mm-hmm.
One of the beautiful things about this tradition is that your life doesn't have to look any particular way in order to be a practitioner in this tradition.
Mm-hmm.
So historically, these have been what are called householder traditions. They're not monastic or, they're not renunciate in the outward conventional sense.
Mm-hmm. So someone might be a director of Extinction Rebellion, for example.
Yes, that's, for example. Right.
Yeah, and then be a practitioner in this. And then with the way that they perceive what they're doing would be informed by the view teaching. So their relationship would be different to, say, someone working in social justice who didn't have that.
Yes. So if you have view teachings and you have practiced, what will happen is your sense of anger and urgency and your feeling that there's actually anything wrong will start to diminish.
Mm-hmm.
And so your participation in those movements, or just being a person speaking about things happening, would be that you feel natural compassion for people's suffering, and or be the suffering of beings, not just people, and that there's a sense of playfulness about it, and also a sense of everything's fine, that everything that's happening is a display. And in the traditions that I've been engaged in, the kinds of words that are used to describe manifest life are a magical display, or the glamour of the Lord, using glamour in like the old sense of magic, and also meaning glamorous. Ramakrishna called this manifest world the mansion of fun. So this sounds horrifying to people who are still not recognizing what's actually happening here at the base. In other words, they still think there's solid objects here, that everything here, that they're individual people, that the world is, they think that reality is something much more solid, and that there's something very much at stake here. And so that creates the sense of urgency and anger at what's happening, and feeling that we're doomed, or that we're victimized, or that someone else is victimized. All of those kinds of feelings arise from our root sense of separation, and our feeling that that everything is as we see it, that, you know, we live in a WYSIWYG world. What you see is what you get. But from the
sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that if your experience from doing practice is that everything here is a living, creative expression of one subjectivity, of one base state, everything is arising from that base state like waves in an ocean, then you are going to be more and more expressive of the wisdom that this ocean is made of. So that ocean of reality is made of compassion and mercy and intelligence and playfulness and clarity, what I call wisdom virtues. As you wake up more, you become more expressive of those things, but you no longer have any why I'm being this way. Like, I am compassionate, or I am feeling for you because. No, it's simply that you are compassionate, you are feeling for beings, you are acting, but there's no other reason other than that's what God does. So it's not because everything's going to hell in a handbasket, or because misogyny, or because homophobia, or because racism. It really just becomes the natural, skillful expression of oneself in the world to care and to act on that caring. And so there's you will become more effective, as if you choose to be an activist, more effective, because you're less bogged down by very, very heavy feelings that things are terribly wrong.
I guess to someone looking out, though, say the rainforest that's burning, and the animals that are becoming extinct, and the pollution, there's so many things to look at and go, well, isn't that all wrong then?
Yeah. Well, first of all, in Hinduism in general, the Lord, I say Shiva, but other traditions say something else, has 5 functions: creation, maintenance and destruction, withdrawal, and emanation. Destruction is natural. And of course, we're not talking about some guy with a lightning stick with a white beard coming down and smiting us. We are the arms and legs of this magical display. We are, there's destructive aspects in us that are expressing that destructive capacity of all of reality. To say, our planet is being destroyed. Well, whole universes blink in and out of existence, whole galaxies, planets come and go, species come and go. If we look at it from that big perspective, there's absolutely nothing unnatural about it. In fact, it would be, from our view of what we know about nature, be utterly odd if suddenly everything just froze in place and nothing's ever destroyed. So what's happening on our planet, and I just want to say that I hope that we survive, and I hope that we survive well, and I'm not totally enlightened, and I still do, have a lot of attachments about, I like the world, I want it to be preserved. But, when I look at the bigger view and what I have also experienced about reality myself, I understand that it's actually natural that things are destroyed and that they have to be destroyed somehow. I mean, again, it's not like everything's perfect and then something comes down out of the sky and blows everything to smithereens. The destruction part of it happens just like it's happening.
Mm-hmm. So what I'm curious about listening to there, because you speak about how in this tradition, generally the path of realization is gradual. It comes over time with practice and with practice and with more practice. And yes, there might be, very rare examples of people that have a major realization in an instant. Yeah. So I'm getting a sense of how you will have walked this journey from being mostly unrealized, you could say, and now you're wherever you are.
Wherever.
Yeah, right. Wherever that might be. Is it a sense of, and when you're speaking there, I got a sense of like widening out or dropping down or becoming more than the smaller aspect of self, but then sometimes dropping into that smaller aspect or contracted, conditional version? Is there sort of back and forth? Does that make sense?
Used to be.
Yeah.
There used to be. And it's very painful when that happens. Have a taste of the more expansive way of being, and then you get all like,
yeah. So when that was happening to you back then,
now there's more of a baseline of continuity, of feeling this continuity between everything that's always there. But I still think it's the shallow end of the pool, from what I can tell. Anyway, it's not about expanding one's individual self. This is something that they talk about, expanding consciousness or expanding this or expanding that. There's nothing to expand. It's really, this speaking about destruction, this process is entirely destructive. There is nothing to create. Everything is already totally awake. And we just have these experiences. We don't even have real obscurations. We just have experiences of obscurations. So, a good way to think of us is that everything that's here is the creative expression of the divine, of that reality. You don't have to call it God. It really makes no difference. I just use that word, but it makes no difference what you call it. You could call it scissors. I mean, people call it, I'm looking at a scissors, people call it Christ consciousness, Buddha nature. My teachers just called it that. It really makes no difference, but it is completely indestructible. And it moves, it has movement, but it doesn't change. It is already completely awake, full of compassion, full of intelligence, curiosity, playfulness, all of these wonderful wisdom virtues. And there's nothing we can do to improve upon it. There is no mission, I think, is an important thing. There is no mission. And the process of waking up is just play. It's just playfulness. It's just what nature does. We have no credit to take for it. The only thing that I can say about it, to my mind, it's the funnest way of being a human. If you're going to be a human, to be on this kind of path is, to me, just the funnest thing one can do. We should stop taking it so seriously and just realize how fun it is. So when we are, in this play of a process of waking up, because there really is nothing to wake up, we are engaging in a destructive process. It's like the classic example is the sun is shining. It's always shining. It's always at full force, but maybe there's some clouds in front of it. And we're getting rid of the clouds. That's all we're doing. So I've heard people, sometimes even people in this who are teaching in this tradition, have this kind of missionary attitude of, the grand thing that we're doing. But this is a fixation. It's not actually related to how things are.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
Maybe it's the Star Trekification of Trika. I don't know.
Yeah,
The beautiful mission.
I'm gonna like making a mental note of that to feel into that more later. That's speaking to me, that particular one. So when you're working with people, so you run it's called a traditional practice, non-traditional community. So you have a community in Maine and Oregon, is that right?
We have some people in Maine, some people in Oregon, but we just moved our headquarters to San Rafael, California.
So that's where you're now in California?
That's where I am right now. That's why there's so much sun.
Yeah. So when you say non-traditional community, what are you referring to?
Oh, a bunch of different things. First of all, it's a really diverse community, and all kinds of expressions are welcome.
Mm-hmm.
And someone walks into a satsang of Jayakula, there'll be people of all ages, all gender expressions, various ethnicities and cultures, and etc. And but that isn't really what makes it a non-traditional community, in my mind. What makes it non-traditional is the absolute lack of dogma that I have been trying to cultivate in our community. And the feeling of freedom of expression, that you can show up however you are. You do not have to subscribe to anything. You don't have to believe anything. You don't have to trust me or anyone. You don't have to like deities. You don't have to do anything but feel some resonance with the teachings, and you can be there as long as you want or as little as you want. And it's really a very open circumstance where people are not being admonished for how they show up, and where we're just being humans together and playing this game together.
I like that, playing the game of being human together. So then when you're working with students and people are coming and they're arriving, do you see common places where people are stuck or obstructed?
Yeah.
What's the most common places where people get stuck on the spiritual?
Well, again, I don't know much about culture in New Zealand, but here in the United States, this is what we call a Titan realm culture. There's a beautiful teaching that initially comes out of teaching stories from an epic literature from India, but was codified into spiritual teachings with specific practices in Tibet, and it's called 6 realms, or the 6 lokas. And it basically describes these big categories of karmic realm visions, lenses through which we see that limit our effectiveness in the world, limit our heart, and inform how we show up in our body, energy, and mind. And one of these is called Titan realm, so, or Titan loka, Asura loka. And the hallmark of Asura loka is competitiveness, and its flip side, fear of public humiliation. So that is the most common way that people show up in a constricted sense. Here, I don't know anyone, I've never met anyone born in the United States who does not suffer from this idea that they have to measure up to something, and if they don't, they're, really feeling badly about themselves. I have never met anyone here that doesn't have some fear of being publicly called out or humiliated. It is really our national disease, and our commander-in-chief is the #1 exemplar of that, carried to the nth possible degree.
He's embodying it beautifully, right?
He's embodying it fully. Oh my God.
Yeah. So the Titan, is Titan as in the god, that word Titan? Yeah.
The Titans are the 6 realms are God, Titan, human, animal, hungry ghost, and hell. And the Titan sits between the gods and the humans, and they're sort of have middle child syndrome. So they would like to be gods, but in order to get closer to God, they they curry favor with the gods, waiting for that day when they can topple them and take over.
Uh-huh.
And then they try to lord it over anyone they think is lesser than. So,
Uh-huh.
any kind of like disparaging of people you feel are weaker than you is a Titan realm kind of expression.
Mm-hmm.
Your fancy towards people you feel are higher up than you with a secret desire to get rid of them. That's
Mm-hmm.
a kind of thing. There's a myriad expressions of this.
Mm.
Fear of exposure is huge.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, in satsang, fear of asking questions, fear of saying the right thing, fear about sounding smart or sounding this or sounding that.
Mm-hmm.
Fear
Yeah.
that you'll make a mistake, fear of making mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
So these are all Titan realm expressions, and they're pretty ubiquitous.
Mm-hmm. So when you see where people are, that filter is running, that's the condition they're experiencing, is there a particular antidote, or is there a particular teaching, or is it just practice and time in various ways? There's no one
Well,
magic.
there are lots of different teachings and lots of different practices.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's nothing that I could,
Yeah.
summarize.
Point two.
But there are integrated practices and also seated practices to work with these various realm fixations or karmic realm visions.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So when you speak of seated practices and integrated practices, so is this a hallmark of the tradition that, yes, you'd sit and do practice every day, but you're also, the practice is embedded into your daily life, like you mentioned before, things you're doing while you're in the supermarket lineup?
Yes. And to a certain extent, integrated practice is considered to be more important.
Mm-hmm. So if you can't sit every day, but you are doing integrated practice every day, then...
It means more if you do sit every day, but then you're a jerk when you get up off the cushion.
Yep. Got it.
That when we get up off the cushion and we go out, that's when we've like compartmentalized and we've turned off our spiritual self and turned on our conventional get it done self. And so we forget who we are and what we're really about and what we actually care about most in the mix of the everyday world. And that's why it's said that doing integrated practice is so effective, because if you can remember to do practice in the moment when you're most liable to forget, that helps you to wake up more.
I find that as a parent, like of all the things, of all the relationships, this one is the one that definitely triggers the most conditioning and patterns, where it's most difficult to stay responsive rather than reactive.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah. So.
Well, another thing is to understand, as they say, are you digesting your circumstance or is it digesting you?
Ooh. Oh, tell me more about that.
Well, I think, people that are in more traditional tantric practices, lineages, or with teachers tend to be fiery, tend to be a little more aggressive in their practice, and tend to have this conceptual fixation that I should be able to deal with anything that happens. I should be able to handle everything, right? And then sometimes we get into relationships or circumstances that we actually aren't handling, that are digesting us, that are, living in our head rent-free for weeks and months and years on end, or causing us a lot of emotional distress that we can't process, or interrupting our lives to such a degree that, we feel off balance all the time. And sometimes people have pride, feeling like, oh, I should be able to deal with this. Or sometimes they have what has been called stupid compassion, where I should be able to take care of the other people in this circumstance. That would be the good spiritual girl thing to do. So there are all kinds of things that get in the way of recognizing when we're being digested. The thing to do when we're being digested is to get out of that circumstance. There's a Buddhist, I think he was an avatar, Padmasambhava, sometimes called the second Buddha. He lived in the 8th century, and he had 2 principal female students, Yeshe Tsogyal and Mandarava. And one time, Yeshe Tsogyal asked him, she said, if there's a lot of things in the environment like noise, disturbances in the environment that are interrupting my practice. What should I do? And he said, head for the hills.
Yeah. Yeah, I see. So sometimes there's a fixation on becoming the one who can handle anything instead of going, just fucking change the circumstance.
Exactly.
Move.
Exactly. Yeah.
Like, I feel like I could keep chatting about all this for a long time, but I'm aware that we have been talking for a while. So I'd love to close off. But before we do, when I was researching you for this interview, I read a couple of articles and I watched some interviews, and I read the one that you wrote about crazy wisdom as a female teacher. Mm. And I found it fascinating how you named the fact that people perceive female teachers differently, and they have different expectations of them, and they project different things onto them. So from your experience, what is that like? How do students treat female teachers differently from male teachers?
Well, I think there's two sides of this coin, one of which is extremely painful, or at least has been for me, and the other of which I recognize as being really beneficial for students. The painful part is just getting, not being given the expressive latitude that is automatically granted to male teachers. Mm-hmm. So, if a male teacher is fierce in a moment, or a male teacher doesn't behave in a nice way, a motherly way, there's no pushback. They have much more expressive latitude. And so then the other side of the coin is that because I'm a woman, I think anyway, students do not always approach me in that kind of faux holy schmoly way that they sometimes approach male teachers. In a sense, they feel more empowered to criticize me, to share their negative feelings with me, to say, I don't like the way you're behaving, even if I think that they're being sexist when they're saying something, at least they said it, Mm-hmm. They're being real. Whereas I feel like sometimes if there's a man, or maybe even a woman, but, a man with a robe on, or a certain way of presenting themselves, or sitting in a certain kind of chair, or having a certain kind of beard or something, or from a certain country, that just that will cause people to perform a kind of reverence that might not be warranted. Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. Kind of respect, assumption that person has some level of realization when it might not be warranted. And so there's still, the communication becomes more stilted. Mm-hmm. So while it's been, at times painful and at times just tiring for me to have, sorry, this is how I am,
Yeah.
I do recognize that there's more opportunity for students to reflect on their own feelings and assumptions in a real way, and maybe progress more quickly than if they were like, it was all buried under a bunch of Guruji's this and Swamiji's that.
Mm-hmm. And just reflecting on how many scandals there have been in the last 10 years or so, where, what I've noticed is, just from an outside perspective, because I haven't necessarily studied with any of these teachers, to me it's like people are projecting an idea of who they think the person is onto them. Patabi Joyce being an example of someone who was an asana teacher, but who knows how realized he was, and yet there was a lot of projection that he was a particular thing or an idea.
Yeah.
The teacher doesn't necessarily dissuade, because I guess it's to their advantage to be perceived in that way.
Exactly. Yeah. And I want to say that I absolutely don't have any sense of blame or judgment when students are, quote, fooled by teachers. Because I feel like that getting fooled comes out of their longing.
Mm.
They may have less clarity at the beginning of the process than at the end, but they got into it because they're longing for something.
Mm-hmm.
And that should always be preserved and honored.
Mm.
I
So
don't know. Sorry, go on.
how can students protect themselves or do due diligence or cultivate their own discernment when they're choosing to work with someone? Like, what should they look for to ensure they're not projecting?
Yeah, I think the number one thing is to look to yourself and see if you are manufacturing any spiritual attitude towards someone. Like, try to divest oneself of anything that feels fake at all.
Mm-hmm.
When you approach a teacher, we can have natural gratitude and natural reverence,
Mm-hmm.
but we can also just, like, random Swami comes to town and all of a sudden everyone's like, look in yourself and see, am I really feeling this? Does this person really make me feel like this?
Mm-hmm.
What is real here?
Mm-hmm.
So that could cut away a lot of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm.
And look to see if you're being manipulated.
Mm.
Look for signs that you're being manipulated.
Mm-hmm.
The best teachers will never manipulate students in order to gain admiration or create some special atmosphere or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
So, there's that. But there's no way that just having a list of things to check off is going to ever solve this problem.
Yeah.
Because, the truth of the matter is that the process of waking up is a process of going from lesser clarity to greater clarity.
Right.
If we get involved with a teacher who's less than savory, and then we realize it later on, hey, at least we gained some clarity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right.
But
Just one.
Can't all be. There's no way we can have perfect clarity at the beginning of this.
Mm-hmm.
Beginning of something, but we're just taking a step back and examining oneself to really stick to the sincerity of how one really feels about a teacher. Try to separate out just the need to be accepted or there were times when I didn't have a teacher and I was just longing and longing and longing for a teacher. And that's hard, and then somebody comes along, you might kind of settle.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's better to be in a state of longing than to settle for someone that you really don't have a feeling for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing your time and your insight and your views with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
And if people want to connect with you, if they want to come and do satsang with you, or do you run retreats or immersions, or what? How can they do this?
Well, first of all, we give away a lot of teachings. So there's a lot of podcasts and video satsangs and all kinds of things on our website, jayakula.org. There's a 4-day immersion coming up in November called Trika Foundations, where you can learn all about this tradition and get a beginning, basic, all-encompassing practice. Mm-hmm. So if you want to come to San Rafael in Northern California to do that, that would be great. And there are also books, and there's so many different ways of accessing.
Yeah. And I loved your books. They were so accessible and they made so much sense to what I was experiencing through my practice and in life. It's like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Oh yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. So there's a couple of your books. Thank you. Yeah. All right.
Okay, Carolia.
Let me just stop that. Oh.
Yeah.